Welcome everybody. This is a double act, so you have a double act here. Okay. So first of all, we're going to introduce ourselves. Both Alexandra and I have a traditional archives background, so we are both traditionally archivists, but we've undertaken the experience of stepping outside that context and into another, namely that of being PhD students and now into academic research. This has been perhaps less unsettling for me because I do still reside in the same ballpark, so I am teaching the MA in Archives and Records Management at UCL. It's been slightly more unsettling for Alexandra because now...
I have a post as a lecturer in digital humanities at Westminster, where I'm in an English department, and so my kind of nearest points of disciplinary contact are with people teaching fine art, museums and galleries students.
So basically this means we're both very mixed up, but Alexandra is even more mixed up than I am. Okay. It also means more to the point, perhaps, that we are very, very sensitive to the context in which we find ourselves. And today we're finding ourselves in this context here, okay? So this is the context of this panel. Now, the reason we're in this context, to be fair, is because of what we wrote in our abstract, and you've all got that, okay? But what we've come to realise, and this is perhaps what we're going to be talking about today, is that there's a tendency, and we kind of include ourselves in this, there's a tendency to always start from a position of difference. And in this case, the kind of difference is this. It's there in the title. So there's this presumption of difference between the physical and the virtual, the online and the on-site experience. We don't actually find ourselves very comfortable in this position anymore. We've come to realise that we don't actually like to start from positions of difference. We are archivists after all, so we actually prefer to start from positions of neutrality or absence of difference. So we're not concentrating on that difference. We're not presuming that difference. Yes, clearly, new technology allows us to do new things. That's without doubt, yeah? But that's actually not what interests us. What we're interested in, and before we get too cross, we are still in scope, because what we're interested in is not that, but this. We're interested in visitors' engagement with collections and with visitor agency. So that's what we're going to be talking about. So, that out of the way, we're now going to have a bit more context, because obviously we are archivists and we love context. So this is the sort of two pieces of work on which this presentation vaguely draws. And I say vaguely draws because it's not a kind of direct link. So these two pieces of work, as you can see, have been carried out separately, and they've been carried out at different time frames and different time spans. So where this presentation comes from predominantly is from Alexandra and I sitting down together over the past few months and trying to pull them together and pull out something from them that will be meaningful in this context that we find ourselves today. So we're going to introduce each of these briefly, and I'm going to start with Alexandra because she started earlier than me.
Okay, great. So this is my doctoral research, which looked at the implications of online user participation for archives theory and practice. So you could use the shorthand term crowdsourcing, but I don't particularly like it, so I'm not going to. This was work that was part sponsored by the National Archives, but I soon discovered that many practical developments in making participatory websites resulted from collaborations which spanned across disciplinary and organisational boundaries. So partnerships with museums and libraries or with subject specialists in academia. Occasionally, sometimes also with the private sector. So that led on then to a further research collaboration with colleagues in the Netherlands on a project called Modelling Crowdsourcing for Cultural Heritage, which I presented at museums in the web conference in Baltimore last year. And it was testing a prototype for a crowdsourcing model for cultural heritage professionals more generally, that we, myself and my Dutch collaborators, began to notice something which Simon's just mentioned in his keynote this morning, this misconception amongst heritage professionals that the main beneficiary of participation is the institution, whereas we wanted to argue that it should very much be the contributors. And so I began at that point to focus my research much more around participants' motivations and experiences.
Okay, and so what I did was recently I worked under a CLASH programme which had its origins in the academic sector. So predominantly it was about providing training opportunities for researchers in arts and humanities to undertake public engagement. But if you undertook the training, you were also eligible to apply for a fellowship to work with a cultural partner, and that's what I did. And the partner that I worked with was the British Postal Museum and Archive in London. So BPMA's mission is to make the sort of history of British postal services available to all. And at the moment, they're building a new museum in Clerkenwell in London, and it's going to have a little train ride underneath the Capitol, if anybody's interested. It's opening soon, so I would go along. But at the moment, they don't have really a gallery as such. So at the moment, they have an archive store and an archive, which is in Clerkenwell, and most of the museum objects are in a big warehouse in Debden. So the only time that you can really access them is on a sort of public tour of the warehouse. So here's the sort of example of what the warehouse looks like. Okay, and so the scope of what I was doing with BPMA was very wide. It was basically what I wanted it to be. And I would like to sort of give you the impression that it was all planned in advance and I knew exactly what I was doing, and that would be a false impression because I had no idea. I was just following my nose, and basically I had to do something. I had 6 months to do it in, so I just got on with it. But what I did do is I did take the decision to sort of concentrate on a particular public engagement activity, which was the tour. Now, I did that for various reasons, partly because at that time, obviously they don't have a museum, so the only way that people could engage directly with the museum's objects was on a museum store tour. So it was the only way that they could do that. But they also did archive tours, so I was then able to compare and contrast the differences between these tours in a museum environment and the archive environment, different types of material, different kind of professional expectations. And it was also because it's not normally the norm. We don't normally engage with either of these objects in this way, so perhaps the norm for engaging with museum objects is by going into a curated gallery. Perhaps the norm for archival objects, engaging with archival objects, is kind of self-directed research in a kind of reading room. So we were trying to sort of step outside the norm and sort of look at people engaging with these things in a way that wasn't necessarily as what would normally be expected. So what I did was I attended a number of the tours in the museum store and the archive. Sometimes I just did nothing. I just sort of acted as a visitor and I observed. But sometimes I did take a more active role. So sometimes I would perhaps ask visitors to complete questionnaires, or I'd ask the visitors to leave comments on the objects they'd seen. And I also attended at the museum store. They had this open day as part of the Loughton Festival. And at that point I ran a kind of crack the code activity, which was to encourage mainly the children, to be honest, to type in the secret code, i.e. known as the object reference, into the iPad to work out what it was from the online catalogue, and then they had to go and run around the store and find it in real life. So it was kind of trying to bring those two things together. So that's what I was doing, and that's what I did. What did I find? Well, I don't really like findings. That suggests that they're just out there to be found, and it also suggests that this is directly coming from it. I've got data, I collected data, so I've got collectings, but I don't really have any findings. What I hopefully have are some meanings. This is what this means, this is what this has come to mean to me. And I want to talk about these two things, the importance of role and expectations, and then taking in agency seriously, and they are kind of interconnected in a way that will hopefully become clear. So as I say, I didn't really know what I was doing on this project, but more importantly perhaps because of that, I didn't actually know who I was being. So I wasn't, despite my professional background in this instance, being the professional representative of the collection and presenting that to the public. That wasn't what I was being. I wasn't really being a researcher, because what I was supposed to be doing was public engagement. So I wasn't quite in my kind of academic researcher role either. In some extent, I was kind of a visitor, so maybe I was being a visitor, but I wasn't being a visitor, because what I was doing was supposedly public engagement as part of this Clash programme, whereas other people were being visitors and just coming on a tour. And what this really made me think about was this relationship between being and doing, because I think that's very important when we think about agency. Because the word agency conjures up the kind of sense of a body of some kind, so you talk about a government agency. But you also think of the sense of that body being constituted or self-asserted through what it does. So it has action in it, it takes action and it has capacity to act. So I think being and doing are quite intimately connected when it comes to agency. And I think sometimes it's very, very useful to not know what you're doing, because then you also don't fall into a role of being a particular person. So with this, I then started to think about what was I being asked to do? I didn't know what I was doing. I was on this tour. So what was I actually being asked to do by the people giving the tour? And this was particularly, I think, what I was interested in was the degree to which I was being asked to look at the objects. Since clearly that's the whole point. I'm being asked to come on this tour to engage with these objects. But was I actually being asked to do that explicitly or implicitly? And it was quite interesting when I sort of started to really kind of listen out for it. So yes, on a number of occasions I was asked to look around. So you're in the store, go and look around, okay? But that was very passive. It's not a it's a pretty vague request, you know, go and look around. And it's quite passive. And it wasn't really encouraging me to actively look. So on occasion, though, I was actually asked to actively look. So for example, as you would expect, BPMA have a lot of pillar boxes in their museum. And even though it's just the store, they do actually have them arranged broadly chronologically. So you go up and down so-called pillar box alley, and when you're going up and down pillar box alley, you kind of see the whole range. And when we were doing that part of the tour, we were asked to do things. So we were asked to, for example, spot the difference. So we were asked to spot the difference between two different pillar boxes. And we were also on occasion asked to count the balls, which is not as rude as it sounds. It's about the number of balls on the pillar box, because that's how you tell they're a different size. You have to count these balls, the decorative balls on the border. So I was being asked to actively do things, and that was asking me to actively look. Now, I didn't do a lot of questionnaire data, but I did. And from that data, what we did ascertain was that for visitors, what really stood out was the pillar boxes. So what people would say, they would say things like, I will take more time to appreciate pillar boxes in the future. Okay? So by making them perhaps actively look, by asking them to do that, perhaps there's a relationship there. So what they will remember and what they will look at again in future is pillar boxes. And why they will do that is because they weren't just asked to look around, they were asked to actively look at the pillar boxes. So while I was doing that in my visitors, I also kind of flipped it on its head, because I realised that I was actually asking people to do things as well. So for example, on one occasion, I asked them to leave comments on the objects they'd seen. This was not a great success. I had one comment and it said, wonderful. Okay? And then I kind of thought, well, you know, what did I expect really? You know, what could I expect? I was asking people sort of the equivalent of, say you've just met somebody, what are you going to say about them, you know? As curators, I think we sometimes forget that we have a very deep, sustained relationship with our objects. People might just see them once. So, you know, what are you going to say about somebody you've just bumped into them other than perhaps, well, they seemed nice? So it's kind of this sort of flipping it round on itself. So what I would say the whole experience has come to mean to me is that it's made me think that I do have to step outside my usual role, in the sense of me knowing what I'm doing or who I'm being. And I would also say that in this kind of activity called public engagement, we do need to pay sort of maybe more attention to what we are asking people to do, either implicitly or explicitly, and then how reasonable is that request? And that's where I'm going to hand over to Alexandra.
Because in the context of user participation, I too have come to view user agency as imperative, really, for moving away from this position that I talked about earlier, that the institution is the primary beneficiary. So what I'm really talking about is seeing things from the participant's point of view. Thank you. Another thing that Simon touched on earlier, this assumption that if we build it, the crowd will come flocking, or what's been called the triumphal rhetoric of online engagement. The thing was, the crowd often doesn't come flocking. In fact, both the National Archives and BPMA can attest to that, because they were both early adopters of wiki technology, and in both cases, those wikis have very quietly been abandoned and their content's been migrated elsewhere. So, as one of my participants in interviews put it, success is down to the participants. Understanding their perspective is very important, because the very success of these projects depends on their willingness to engage. So before we reach out into the ether expecting to inspire these crowds of users to take part in cultural heritage, we need to think a lot more about why, or in fact whether, members of the public would spend their time doing tasks which are very familiar to us because it's our professional domain, but why, as a member of the public, would you want to contribute your time, skills, or expertise? What personal benefits or rewards might you get from the time you spend contributing? How can we, as the professionals involved in setting up these types of projects, how can we help to support participants, to steer their participation, to sustain their participation over time? Conversely, what barriers might exist? What happens to the huge majority of people who sign up to take part but very, very quickly drop out again? So this is a framework, it's a synthesis really of around 50 interviews with participants in various online participation websites and 545 responses to a survey of the registered members of the Old Weather crowdsourcing website. Now, I haven't got time to go through this in detail today, but what I particularly wanted to pick out is the potential for an effective enjoyment through participation, as well as a more sustained cognitive engagement with cultural heritage. And that effective, this is where I'm going to depart a little bit from Simon's call to go back to volunteering models for crowdsourcing, because that effective engagement can actually, in some cases, be very fleeting, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's not meaningful in some other way to the people taking part. Participation experiences, I found, can also vary between those for whom the community, the other people taking part in the project, is very important, and again, a much larger proportion of participants who either don't interact at all or they engage only very rarely with other people because they've got a problem of some kind. They can't read the handwriting, for instance. So I needed to be able to differentiate between the motivation of people who, and this is often within the same project, the motivation of people who want to do something useful or were up for a challenge in some way. So it might be deciphering tricky handwriting, for instance, from those who were just up for a kind of late at night, trying to chill out kind of task, something that didn't actually require a huge amount of brain power. And I think that whereas as professionals, we've got this tendency to model online participation on established audiences, so volunteers and the readers that we're used to seeing coming through our doors. So these people are relatively experts, local or family historians or academics, say, and they have the staying power, the sustainability power of an intrinsic interest in the subject matter. And for us, then, this idea that online engagement might be turned into some kind of game, that participants' main motivation for taking part might simply be to have fun, and particularly that might be a competitive form of fun, that tends to be a really alien concept. We're much more accustomed to thinking of heritage institutions as places of applied personal reflection or of scholarship. So the idea behind this framework was to try to differentiate between these diverse perspectives that the participants bring to a participation project, independently of that kind of on-site lens through which we usually regard them as cultural heritage professionals, and to suggest that variations in motivation and experience lead to differing task satisfaction and engagement and participation productivity.
Okay, so we're gonna change our title, basically. Yeah. So this is our conclusion. Okay, we've come to the conclusion that our title betrays our professional, and we are still archivists, I think, obsession, and we're going to use the word obsession with the stuff we look after. We're privileging here the collections, whether they're blended or not. So we're going to cross that out. Okay, what we think we would rather say is we're going to say this. We're going to enhance. The only way we're going to enhance engagement experiences is if we are a lot clearer about what we are asking others to do and why on earth they would want to do that anyway. Okay, so I know it's not particularly snappy, The other was a bit snappier perhaps, but this is probably a clearer expression of what we've been trying to say. So thank you very much.